Okay, cool.
Okay.
I don't know. You might have to do 2 separate YouTube videos.
Yeah.
Our video cut off an hour back. And we only talked like for a minute about zone of proximal development. So.
But first grade teachers are awesome because they have to really pay attention to that development, that proximal development, where it's like they assess each kid and they have a schedule where it's like, okay, I'm meeting with these 5 kids this day, then this, and like they have a schedule, but they understand what kids aren't getting when it comes to words, like, and then they develop a word study that they do one-on-one with the teacher. And so, like, if you have a student who, through your assessment, you learn that they don't know short vowels, you're going to design a word study that's going to have, like, pig, cup, and then you are going to have words, and you're going to model with that kid, like, oh, so cup, does that sound more like pig? And, like, you go through that with them, and then they can do that on their own separately, and each kid has their own set of words. They have their own word studies, and they get a new one like every week. And they're like, the teacher is constantly assessing where they are developmentally, and they make time to spend time working with that kid to push them higher into their level.
What's the difference? I mean, like, how would you show the difference between like differentiation of your teaching and like teaching to like the zone of proximal development? Like, what's the? I think the same thing, kind of, or
like
your differentiation.
I think that doesn't mean necessarily like developmentally that they're like not the same as another child. Like they could be in the same, but like you could have language, which would cause
that's true.
that variation where you need differentiation.
You
know, or if you like, I worked with a 2nd grader who was just as like understanding of the math that the other 2nd graders were working on, but he kind of had like a language barrier, and so we like would accommodate or like provide like differentiation, like where he would like just get to circle on his paper, I guess, like the answers as opposed to like writing out why. Because developmentally he could do the same math, but he couldn't pick up that pencil and like write a sentence because that was too much of a stretch for him.
If that makes sense. Yeah, I think it's just interesting because there's just like different like terms like that are very similar that apply to how you teach and how you go about, modeling for students and how you almost separate them into their own little categories of levels.
I think it gets hard too when there's some subjects that go with other subjects, and so it's hard when you're trying to combine them, but they might be developmentally in different groups, and that's when you need to start providing like a common like differentiation where it's like math's the same, but the reading's not the same.
Yeah.
So how do we? So how are they going to read that problem?
Or I see a lot of like, I feel like there's a lot more room for differentiation or zone of proximal development in like literacy. And it's just maybe it might be different, but I just remember from my practicum, like math and science were always the subjects that were very like the whole class works on the same thing. Like in my 5th grade class, they were all together working on the science process, scientific method. Yeah, they were all working on that together, and they all did the same project, all at the same time, at the same steps.
I think it depends on the teacher, because like I worked with a 2nd grade teacher who it was like science wasn't just like a subject of the day with her. It was she would rotate groups of kids that had a project that they would work on at certain parts of the day, and they would, so it'd be like 5 kids who had like one topic that they were working on for like this week, and she made sure that project was set to those group of kids specifically, and then those kids would present, and then the next group would start, but they were different projects, but essentially eventually they were kind of learning the same thing, but they were different according to who was in that group, which I thought was a really good way of like differentiating. So it was like, I felt like the majority of the time in her classroom, the kids weren't like in a big group. Like it was just constantly like, she had time to move around the classroom in every single subject. She had different assignments for different kids and like could manage all of that. Like it was controlled chaos, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah, because that, in my experience, it was mostly big group for like math and science at least. Like the math was differentiated because there was another 5th grade class right next door, and they would switch. They would switch classes. Like some kids of his class would come here, and some of her kids would go there, depending on the level or something. But they would all be doing the same worksheet at the same time.
Yeah, I think it might be how much work you're willing to put in, not like trying to batch that teacher.
No, but that's true. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a lot of planning.
Yeah.
To think about every single kid, every single subject, every single day.
I wonder if she
manage all of that.
Yeah.
Or what that teacher did in the beginning of the year to set up that classroom to be that successful like that for the rest of the year.
Yeah. I wonder if like she just didn't think about it, or like creativity wise, I don't know, because she worked really hard, and I feel like now like you explaining that teacher, I feel like that sounds way easier than what my teacher did, because she would always be at the front of the room and trying to get everyone's attention.
Yeah, and she was all about giving like very open-ended assignments. Like, okay, you have these resources, figure it out. And she knew how to pose the questions to make them either put them on a different track or continue to go even farther on the same track they were, which was really interesting to watch.
Yeah.
I've seen it done really well on the high school level, where it was like the idea was you wanted students to think critically and start to learn about the Constitution. And so then what the teacher did is he basically had his whole week was pretty open, like in giving the students time, and the students there were different tasks available to them to help them understand the Constitution, but they were at different levels. So some of it was as simple as like doing a flow map of the beginning of Article 1, where some of them got far more complex, where they're asking students to do some higher level analysis, they're asking them to synthesize some different sources. But then, even with what every different student did, they still come together and they do some different group work with that, and then they have like a full class Socratic seminar on the subject. So while different students were able to challenge themselves in different ways, ultimately all students were benefiting because they can all, even no matter what level the task was, every student still has something to bring to the discussion. Like just because a student can't jump on top of a concept quite as quickly or adeptly as another student doesn't mean that without a little, or with a little time, the student will be able to produce something and be successful. Do you want to talk about the Colapinto article a little bit?
Yeah, that's the raw language one.
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit.
I had a money question for that one.
I had a money question for that one too.
Yes. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. Mine was just that it kept being brought up, the competition between Everett and Chomsky, and I read into it a little more and tried to understand it, but I get where it's a conflict, but in the article, Everett said, a Piraha child removed from the jungle at birth and brought up in any city around the world, he said, would have no trouble learning the local tongue. So on one hand, he's saying Chomsky's wrong, but I felt like that quote was something that supported Chomsky.
Universal grammar.
Yeah.
Well, basically that then the Piraha children do have like this, because I thought the big thing with Chomsky is just the language acquisition device, and then so I get Everett's point, and I think the example of the Piraha absolutely makes sense. That depending on your culture, especially if you have values like they do, which are very unique cultural values. Relative, and they live in a pretty unique environment where they've been physically isolated from. Not isolated from other tribes, but let's be real. You're up on the Amazon. You are a little isolated from the rest of the world. Deep jungle. So the culture can affect that, but they still then do have like this basic thing that's helping them be human, right? So I thought that. So I was just having difficulty understanding then like how wrong he was saying Chomsky is, or like it's totally turning it on its head. Culture, language is, it's all cultural, I guess. But at the same time, it's like, but Chomsky's point about, and perhaps why Chomsky was getting so mad, was because he's not really saying anything about universal grammar, and the fact that universal grammar for Chomsky is like, it's like the basic like algorithms in our brain, in our DNA. It's like the kind of very basic root that gives us the ability to put basically like reason and mathematics into how that produces a language. So that language acquisition device is still what is producing the Puraha language, but it's just taking all these unique pathways. And obviously communication then on top of that has all kinds of different there are different kinds of ways different cultures then communicate too, because then they obviously, and then it showed kind of the balance between like what is learned versus what is acquisition, because they probably do have, there's probably a lot more learning going on in the Puraha language to learn like the hums and the rhythms and the whistles.
Yeah, so like my question was like similar-ish kind of to yours, where it was like, it appears to me that after reading this piece from Everett that he is making a point using Puraha as an exception to Chomsky's generalizations to be lethal towards his work. Like he's kind of like using this as so look at this community, so pretty much everything that Chomsky is saying, like, it's wrong. It was kind of how I took it that he was writing it about.
Or it was like presented that way, like a little too much.
Yeah, and so yeah, and so then I was thinking, well, like his point is valid, but like should languages be? And then I started to think, like, should languages be subjected to generalizations? How do we make sense of languages if we don't have generalizations? Because I thinking like in the science world, or even in our language, there's like exceptions to every rule, or there's exceptions to a lot of theories, but we don't just like throw it out. We're just not like, oh, well, like that Y, I know that sometimes you're a vowel, but like, okay, vowels just like don't exist,
Yeah.
And so I understand Chomsky's frustration that Everett made like all of this big thing to diminish all of this work that he did. To be like, here's my example.
Yeah.
But then there's also some arguments that say that if there's one counter argument to like a rule or something, then that rule doesn't exist. Like,
and how do we decide that?
Like it. I don't know.
But that's like what you said. Like, there's exceptions in language.
There's exceptions in language. That's why I'm like, should we just say that we can't make generalizations in languages? But like, how would we study and make use, or like,
well, like in
how
language,
do we study it?
Never use the word like always or never or anything, because it's sometimes, most of the time, like not often, or you don't use those strong, powerful words that limit.
Yeah. It also just highlights kind of the seriousness of the field of linguistics then, that these questions are so big and open about language, and it's something that we just, it just shows, Chomsky in the 1960s, having a big, epiphany basically for everybody, being like, oh man, we got to think about what we think about, like how we think, and the language we use. Yeah. So it was kind of a big moment for humanity to start kind of like looking inwards, and we still have a lot more of that to do in terms of understanding exactly what affects how we think, and we're still learning a lot about the brain. So.
It also made me think too that it's like, okay, well, who's right? Like, it was very opinionated both ways, obviously, and there's reasons why it was opinionated both ways, and like why there's frustrations on both sides. But then it's like if you read it, it's like, okay, well, who's the right one? Like, who's correct in their opinion? And I mean, like, you kind of want to lean towards Chomsky just because he had this huge, well-known theory and everything, and then Everett had this one example. Everything. I don't know. It was just like, for me, I just thought about like, okay, well, whose side do you want to pick? Like, is there like, should you pick a side, or are they both right, or in some ways, or?
Well, and then it also raises like, because one of the things I was thinking of like, well, what about all the evidence that I learned about for universal grammar, like all the stuff we talk about with babies and the problem of stimulus and that kind of stuff. And it's like, so how do you start taking what you learned about the Praha and bringing it into like actually like then talk about that other research, like what, like, because that seemed like one of the most difficult things that they were trying to do out there was like, how do you even develop studies and how do you develop like research for the Praha, because they found out so many of them didn't work because of the cultural disconnect. Like there just was no way to like our science just didn't work with them, basically. Like there were a couple different examples in the article of like failures different researchers had. And then you have to, but then it made me think of questions like, so then how much of the research we do on babies then is, it's, I guess, what are we missing there? Like, if Chomsky's not right, like, well, then is it the fact that like we're designing tests with results already in mind because of the idea of universal grammar? Are our babies just already in a place where they're starting to understand like English language, and they're actually picking up. We don't understand how quickly they process the stimulus around them. I don't know. So.
Well, it also is like you can take babies for example, and you more often than not they're always around people and everything, so they're hearing those noises and everything. But then if you take, have you guys heard the Jeannie story?
Oh, where she was in the basement.
Where she was in the room for like 7 years and wasn't, or however long it was.
Oh yeah.
And like
she's almost like feral, right? Or like that's a weird word, but
she just like sat there, and so she never learned how to talk, and so it's like so now she's 12 or something. I don't know. I don't remember her ages, but now she's a certain age, and she can't talk. Like she can only like stutter noises. So it's like, does universal grammar, like, does that gene or that DNA apply in that way? Like, is she still like? I know she was like really heavily into that physical therapy and that everything after to teach her how to talk, but she still wasn't really able to because she lost that time. Yeah. I don't know.
I guess it would take more research on like the early the effects of culture on the child brain, like, but that's so difficult to just to research because like first of all, culture itself is already like a super difficult concept. Concept, like, is that even the right word? But like, I had a philosophy professor here in the MIT department, and then like one of our questions one time, when we get basically down to this point where the more questions you ask about culture, the more you realize it doesn't exist. Well, at the same time, it does exist. So culture is like totally created by people, and it's this mass generalization, and it has these very real effects. So then, how do you develop studies to actually measure the physical effects? Like, I guess you'd have to study like side by side tons of Praha brains. Like you'd have to be getting MIT. You'd have to be getting scans of their brains as time. Watch how lobes develop. If you were really to start to begin to really think about how is their culture changing the way their brain works and the way that their brain takes in language, uses language, conveys meaning, and how they think basically. If they really aren't thinking in terms of future and past at all, it's big, it's a big I mean, it's like, the article said dropped a bomb into the party. I mean, it does open up a lot of big questions about just the way things work, to see an example that's so counter to our own, especially with the no numbers thing. I mean, it's just like, because the no numbers thing, in the Vygotsky article, it said one of our basic psychological tools was language in my section. And then the second thing it said was one of our most basic psychological tools was numeration. So, I mean, so they didn't have that.
I'm just gonna check the time.
Yeah, we're over.
Okay.